Good day, History 365. So today I actually want to spend a little time considering different patterns of how the invaders, the conquerors, in both the western and the eastern parts of the Roman Empire um, interface with the populations that they come to control. And we're going to consider two aspects. The first, economic aspects. How are they economically exploiting the territories that they've obtained? And secondly, we're going to look at the religious aspects, in particular, the role of religious difference when it comes to conquest and the maintenance of control. And so here we'll be thinking about both the Germanic groups that have moved into the Western Roman Empire in the late 4th, 5th, into the 6th and 7th centuries AD. These are the Germanic kingdoms that now control parts of northern Italy, Gaul, what's now today France, Britain, and Spain. And then we'll be thinking to the Arabs who have come into control of large chunks of the East Roman Empire in the 7th century. So let's start off with the economy, and I think this goes back to a theme that we talked about on the first day of the course. War is exploitation. A driving factor behind warfare is to secure resources in one way or another. And I think actually what's interesting is that we actually see two very, very different solutions for the invaders that settle within the Roman Empire, to how they're actually going to exploit the territories from which they've obtained to continue to maintain the military forces that they need to perpetuate their control. So the first solution, which is most common in the West, is to simply appropriate land and give it to the individual warriors who are part of these war bands that have moved into various parts of what had been the Western Roman Empire. So the granting of land from which creates estates that those warriors can subsequently support themselves primarily off the produce of their estate. This is the primary strategy that various Germanic groups utilize as they enter into what had been Roman territory. Now, it's important to note, these groups are not particularly numerous. This isn't, again, the barbarians overrunning and killing and displacing the Romans who had lived there. This is actually, at most, several tens of thousands of Germanic peoples moving into places that are inhabited in many instances by millions of Romans. So they're a distinct minority. So they're given usually nice estates, and then they can subsequently farm those estates to provide for their economic needs while being on standby to support the leaders who control the barbarian kingdoms that have arisen in the western provinces. Now, this form of economic exploitation has several follow-on implications for what the economy and politics of Western Europe is going to look like. For one thing, it leaves Western Europe with a markedly unmonetized economy. That doesn't mean there aren't coins. These barbarian kingdoms mint coins, circulate coins, and at times use the coins to pay those troops they call to active service. But when these troops are then subsequently dismissed back to their estates, they don't need to be paid. They now have land and they can support themselves. And as a result, the economies of Western Europe, because of this form of military exploitation, are going to be relatively unmonetized. Not, again, there's still money, but less monetized than when we look to the East. It's also going to be the basis for what will eventually evolve into the landed military aristocracy of medieval Europe. Now, again, I want to stress we're moving towards the feudal system. We'll get to the feudal system this week, but we're not at the feudal system as commonly defined as explicit grants of land that have specific demands for military service linked to them. This is going to develop in the Carolingian era. But nonetheless, we do have the basic idea of you have barbarian followers, you need to take care of them. How are you going to take care of them? Well, just give them land. That's going to be a sort of basic aspect that's already there that Carolingian and subsequent Norman feudalism can build upon when we get into the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries. So we now have these barbarians who are settled on the land, and this is the primary way that they exploit the conquests that they make as they pull the Western Roman Empire into pieces, largely through land grants. Now that's going to be different when we look what the Arabs do when they settle into huge chunks of what had been the Eastern Roman Empire, and eventually actually parts of the Western Roman Empire as they move into North Africa and Spain. There, rather than, and again, this in many ways these invasions are migrations. The warriors who are parts of these successful armies that enter into Syria and Iraq and Egypt, in many instances they stay in the place where they've conquered. So they're not just out to fight for a while and then go back to wherever they were herding camels in the Arabian Peninsula. They say, hey, this is pretty nice. This is a pretty nice place. Let's stay here. And so the armies are settling. We have conquest and invasion as a form of armed migration, but they're not given land. Rather, a decision is made that the taxes will be levied upon conquered peoples. Those taxes will then be used to essentially make stipendiary payments to the Muslim warriors and their families at this point who have settled on the land. What happens is the central state, the Caliphate, maintains huge rosters that determine who's eligible for these payments. And these are called the Diwan. And once your name is on the list for the Diwan, you're then basically, you have what we might today call universal basic income. You're eligible to receive a cut of the taxes that are collected from the region, and this is how you support yourself. Conveniently, you don't have to spend all day farming. You're not necessarily tied to land, and this also makes you available to either volunteer or be called up for further military operations. So this form of exploitation has a number of follow-on implications. Firstly, because it's administered by the state itself, by the Caliphate, this actually leads to the Caliphate, first, which we refer to usually as by the dynasties that control it. So the Umayyad Caliphate, and then it subsequently falls in the 8th century and is replaced by the Abbasid Caliphate. But the state apparatus is going to be much, much more intensive because now you need bureaucrats who can engage in kind of the complex record keeping of determining, well, who's on the Diwan, who is eligible for payments, whose heir is eligible for payments, and who's the heir as time goes by, keeping track of the descendants. And this requires an administrative apparatus, a relatively robust administrative apparatus that doesn't, for the most part, emerge in the Western kingdoms. The barbarian kingdoms that form, and I stressed earlier, these are weak kings who oftentimes are surrounded by no more than a small number of retainers and courtiers. They aren't sitting on a robust state apparatus, but they don't have to. Their people are taken care of simply because they've received the land and now they farm it and take care of themselves. So the Caliphate therefore becomes a much more robust state because of this particular modality of exploitation. It also becomes a much more monetized state. Again, the Franks or the Saxons, they don't have to necessarily in the 6th or 7th centuries AD collect a lot of taxes. Their people are taken care of via their land grants. Looking into what had been the East Roman Empire, the Caliphate has to collect taxes from anyone who's not a Muslim, and therefore are collecting taxes, transferring that money to the people in the D1. And this process of tax collection and payment keeps the economy highly monetized. I mean, the Eastern Mediterranean has always been the more economically diverse and intensive. So in some ways, it's easier for them to do this to begin with, building on just the economy of the Eastern Roman Empire. But it keeps it much more economically intensive. And so this is going to be one reason if we kind of look at the fate of the economies of the East and the West. The East is going to be much, much more, for most of the Middle Ages, much more economically prosperous, in part because you have a state structure that's deliberately essentially churning money to pay these folks on the Diwan, but this has the advantage of actually, in some ways, kind of priming the pump for the monetary economy to begin with. If you're a Christian subject and now you have to pay the taxes to these Islamic invaders, and again, as we'll see with religion, they don't want people to convert precisely because they want it's the non-believers who pay the taxes, but you have to make a monetary payment that can then eventually get shunted to somebody on the D1. Now you have to engage in the necessary economic activity to come up with the extra cash to make the payment. And it seems actually that, particularly in the ancient world, collecting taxes in cash prompts people to intensify their economic activities. It actually is stimulative to ancient and pre-modern economies. Taxation is, in a strange way, good for you, or at least good for the economy, which is maybe not how we always think about that today. Therefore, because of this stipendiary-based system, collecting taxes and then paying the settled invaders, we actually have, again, the East looks very different. A much stronger state with administrators and a bureaucracy, and also a much more monetized economy. Whereas in the West, we have weak states and a relatively unmonetized economy, simply because you've settled your warriors and diffused them onto the land where they farm the land, or they have their people farm the land, and then they take care of themselves. This is admittedly a crude generalization, but I think when you look how different parts of the carved up Roman Empire get exploited by these outside peoples, the differences in modality can actually be quite striking. All right, so that's economic exploitation. Now let's actually talk about religion. In both instances, the invaders have a different religion than the predominantly Orthodox Christian population that we find throughout the Roman Empire by the late Roman period. Indeed, Roman emperors have worked very, very hard to try to make sure that the population is uniformly Orthodox, even though there's always a churning diversity of belief within late Roman Christian communities. Now, by and large, the invaders in both the East and West are not Orthodox Christians. In the East, it's obvious. It's a new religion. Again, initially, the Romans say, are these heretics? They believe something very strange, but Jesus and certain elements of Christian eschatology are recognizable. Over time, they come to realize, oh, there are really some quite extraordinary differences from what Muslims believe compared to what we believe, including the most obvious being in Islam, Jesus is a prophet to the Romans, whereas in Christianity, he's actually an aspect of the Trinity that is God. So we have these. So there's a huge religious difference between the conquerors and the conquered, and indeed that will come to determine exactly how you're exploited. If you're Muslim, you don't pay taxes. You instead are enrolled on the D1 and receive money. If you're a non-believer, your primary form of exploitation is you gotta pay up. Now, I think it's actually important to note, for both Christianity and Islam, forced conversions are considered highly illegal. You are not supposed to take, if you are invading someplace, you're not supposed to put a sword to somebody's neck and say, convert or die. Now, Christians will, at times, violently, forcibly convert Muslims, and Muslims will, at times, forcibly try to convert Christians. We should note that the authorities, whether it's Islamic scholars or Christian ecclesiastical authorities, consider this a war crime. So it happens just as any kind of military that has a kind of law of war. You will find people who violate that. This is a sort of part of the law of war. You're not supposed to use violence to forcibly convert people, and yet it happens, and it's considered a crime. And actually, the authorities sometimes will have to sit down and say, okay, what happens to the people who just got forcibly converted? Do they have to stay, or can they sort of unconvert, revert, I guess. But suffice it to say, the goal, when particularly in the Islamic invasions, is definitely not to convert people. It's actually to keep them the way they are, so you can tax the bejesus out of them. Now, in the West, things are a little different. Many of the barbarian groups entering into the Roman Empire are already Christian. The Christianity has spread from the Roman frontiers beyond. Actually, in some ways, that's really a good kind of almost metric of Rome's ability to exert control beyond the frontiers. These barbarians entering the frontiers are in many instances Christian, with one itty-bitty difference. Many of them, particularly the Goths, are not Trinitarian Christians. They adhere to a, by Roman standards, heretical belief called Arianism. And essentially in Arianism, Jesus is not considered to be either co-equal or co-eternal to God the Father. So Arians essentially believe that you have God the Father that created everything, and Jesus is still a divine and important being, but he is not God the Father. He's created by God the Father, therefore he's not co-equal by God the Father. He's not co-eternal, and he's somehow, kind of his right-hand man. He's not co-equal. So this is a Roman heresy. It's propounded by a priest named Arius of Alexandria, but it becomes very popular beyond the Roman frontiers for whatever reason. And so these barbarian invaders entering, in many instances, are Christian, but they're heretical Christians. Now, there are some barbarians also, including a number of the Saxons and even the Franks, who are also just straight up pagan. They're still worshipping kind of traditional pantheon of gods. Now, the question is, well, what will happen? The heretics, the Arians, resist converting to the Catholic Christianity of their subject peoples. Nor incidentally, do they try to convert their subject peoples to what they consider their orthodoxy, to Arianism. And there actually seems to be a reason for this. If you are a barbarian warrior, and you're one of these, let's say, 10,000 people that have entered into a part of the Roman Empire and formed a barbarian kingdom, you may actually be quite nervous if your leader, whatever petty king or chief or whatever you call him, starts acting too Roman, starts wearing Roman clothes, which they do, adopting Roman manners, which they do, drinking good Roman wine, which they do, wanting to marry a local Roman woman, which they do. Because, you're in a hierarchy. A lot of common warriors know they're at the bottom of the totem pole of the barbarian hierarchy. But if that hierarchy subsequently just sits separate upon the rest of the society, that means that even if you're at the bottom of the barbarian hierarchy, well, you're above everybody else. You therefore do not want assimilation. If you and your people, let's say the Goths, stop being Goths or stop being recognizably Goths, and if a common Goth has nothing to differentiate him from a common Roman, the people at the bottom of the Gothic hierarchy are the losers. They go from being, let's say, foot soldiers of a barbarian warband or a Gothic warband that set up shop, but nonetheless are the lowest men at the top of the totem pole. But if there's assimilation, they go just to being right at the bottom along with the lowliest Roman peasant. So it may be that the followers want something to differentiate them and their leaders from the rest of Roman society, to make sure that there can never be too much assimilation. And for a long time, one solution is heresy. If we believe in a form of Christianity that is repugnant to our Roman subject population, then we remain separate. We remain aloof. And this is very much the case of the Visigothic kingdom in both Spain and for a while in southern Gaul. Now, you can see the sort of model that I've described, I think explains why you want to keep aloof from your subject population. In some ways, it creates solidarity amongst the actual barbarian warband. It allows leaders to have a degree of solidarity with the people that they still need to coerce the whole system that they sit upon. But there's some real disadvantages because, again, there aren't all that many barbarians. In many places, each barbarian kingdom may have 10,000, 15,000 barbarian warriors, whether it's Franks or Goths or Burgundians or Saxons. So if you keep that group aloof, if you don't actually try to engage with and seek collaboration from the broader society, you can't necessarily mobilize the wider resources of the society that you sit upon if you face a more serious threat. The Goths, for example, really never connect with their subjects in Spain. Very few Gothic loanwords enter into what the modern Spanish language. And it also means that when the Goths face a challenge, namely, the Arab invasions have gone across North Africa and they've crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and they're entering into Spain, the Goths cannot withstand it. They can't mobilize the deeper resources of that territory that they need to resource. They're at a constant tension with the sort of Catholic subject peoples, and they get completely mowed over by the Arab invaders, who conquer much eventually of Spain, with the exception of a few places in the foothills of the Pyrenees, and who incidentally, although this religious difference is maintained, have a much closer and happier connection, so that Spanish is full of Arabic loanwords. If you take in Spanish, there's all of these words that sound a little weird, and then it's because they come from Arabic. Now, it is notable that these raids, which go through Spain, which basically knock out the Visigoths, which basically stop the Pyrenees, in theory continue into southern Gaul. There is an Arab or Islamic raiding party. At this point, it may not even be ethnically Arabic because it's picked up a lot of Bedouin peoples. In past times might have been called Numidians. But it enters into southern France and is beaten by the Franks, famously at the Battle of Tours or the Battle of Poitiers in the early 8th century A.D. Exact date unknown, but probably 730s. Now, there will be some people who say, well, this battle saves Christendom, or this battle saves Western civilization. We don't know much about the battle. It may simply be this raiding party very far from home, across the Pyrenees, gets just knocked around by the Franks, and that's it. Maybe a rather anticlimactic great battle in world history. That being said, there may be a reason why the Franks are able to muster the resources they need to stop the sort of Islamic advances into what's now southern France, when the Visigoths couldn't do it. The Visigoths remain religiously aloof from their population and therefore disconnected. They get swept away. The Franks, however, and this actually goes back to a much earlier time, to the early 6th century, have made a decision and this decision is supposedly made by Clovis, the great king of what's now called the Merovingian dynasty. But Clovis makes a conscious decision to convert to Christianity. And not just any Christianity, the Catholic Christianity of most of his Roman subjects. Now, the main reason it seems that he wants to do this is he wants their backing so that he can bash the Visigoths out of southern France, where they still are. He's successful in doing this. But this means that the king of the Franks is now religiously the king of everyone in this post-Roman world, given that the population is predominantly Catholic Christian. He therefore has a connection that goes beyond his relatively narrow Frankish warband. And this probably is one reason why he's subsequently able to mobilize the deeper resource. Well, it's not him. While the Frankish kingdom is subsequently able to mobilize the deeper resources of the kingdom to ultimately defeat to win the victory that takes place at Tours or Poitiers. So, at any rate, those are just some thoughts thinking about this post-Roman world, this early medieval world in both East and West, looking at the lens of both the economy, exploitation, thinking about the role of religion in how it both organizes exploitation and also kind of binds society together to possibly make it more militarily resilient. So we will talk more on Wednesday, where we'll finally, after much delay, get to the Carolingians. I'll see you then.